The God of High School is one of the hottest and most promising anime that came out in the summer of 2020. If you didn't know, it's adapted from a Korean webtoon comic series by the same name, so there's already a fan base way before the anime came out. Now, some of those people are saying, just because it didn't follow the comics exactly, is bad. Those people are silly and wrong. The anime has fantastic artwork, the fight scenes are awesome, and so is the soundtrack, by the way. And all of that is great, but what makes this anime, but more specifically episode 1, so good is the writing. The first episode of God of High School wasn't perfect by a long shot, but it's pretty damn good. So I went back and I watched it again to find out what exactly is so good about the writing in this particular episode. And this is what I found. The best thing about episode 1 of God of High School is the character introduction. There is literally character introduction in the first episode of everything, but this one did it really, really well. The way this episode is structured is it has two halves. One is the character introduction, and the second is the actual God of High School tournament. From what I understand, because I haven't read the comics, the character introduction portion is a little bit different from the webtoon version, but the anime version is one of the best character introduction sequences I've ever seen in an anime. Considering how it introduces 3 of the main characters at the same time, it did a really good job of setting up the environment around them as well, and that's just as important as the character intro itself, all while setting up an action sequence that would show how the 3 of them interact with each other is damn near flawless. The episode uses a storytelling technique called character defined by action. It's basically the same thing but more specific version of the saying show don't tell. To make it really simple, it's basically a concept that says the things a character do is who they are. Their action is their word. This means we actually get to see the character come to life with every action they take. We barely get any exposition about these characters being told to us through voiceovers or internal monologue at all, which is really great. Every action taken by each character is carefully crafted and laid out to help with the intro and getting the audience connected with them. We're getting so much information about these characters and who they are in just about 8 to 9 minutes, which is really, really short for introducing 3 characters. It keeps the dialogue to the minimum and there's practically no exposition dump at all, which is really great. I want to go through each of the 3 main characters' introduction one by one and show you where they start, where they end, and the massive amount of information given to us in a really short amount of time through clever storytelling. Let's start with Jin Mori. He's the protagonist of the show, so naturally he has the most scene introducing and fleshing out his character. There is exactly 5 of them. Scene number 1, we see a flashback of him and what I assume is his grandfather. Scene number 2, we see him waking up in his apartment and him realizing he's late to something. Scene number 3, we see him riding his bicycle and trying to get somewhere really quickly. Scene number 4, he sees this old lady getting her purse snatched. And scene number 5 is where he actually goes after the purse thief. Those are pretty much all that was needed to introduce this character, to show us who he is as a person. So let's take a closer look of what we just saw. Let's start with his apartment. The environment a person is in can tell a lot about them. There's a futon and a clock. That's it. This shows that he's very simple and he doesn't really care for much. But if he does care about something, he holds them extremely close to him. You can see this with the picture of him and his grandfather hanging on the wall. It's literally the only other notable thing in this room beside himself. Then there's the busted up clock. He wakes up and instantly realizes he's late, so he has to skip breakfast. It shows that he lets his bad habits get the better of him, and he gets himself in trouble because of it. Possibly often as well. And this trait comes in again in episode 2 when he interferes with the fight that he's not supposed to be in. Next is the way he rides and carries himself on his bicycle is extremely reckless, and he almost hits someone because of it. Obviously, it shows that he's reckless, and it also shows that he's very confident in himself and his skills. Later, as he agonizes over his mistakes, he sees someone in distress, the old lady who just got her purse stolen. He did not at all hesitate to help her. He did not even for a second consider the consequences he would face by doing so. It shows that he's the type of person that put others before himself. It shows that he has a good heart and he never hesitates to do the right thing. And the little story he puts together in his head about the old lady is totally hilarious. When he is chasing after the thief on a motorcycle, he got shaken off multiple times. He never gives up or never show any doubt at all that he will catch up to him. This of course speaks to his confidence and his skills, but also shows his tenacity and the fact that he doesn't know how to give up. We have yet to see him struggle in a fight against someone who's better than he is, but I can tell that if he was losing in that fight, he'd never say I surrender. With only 5 scenes sprinkled throughout the span of merely about 10 minutes, we know that Jin Mori is someone who's simple in his life philosophy. He can be reckless, but also has a very good heart, always does the right thing, often puts others before himself, and sometimes lets his bad habits get the better of him. We also got a pretty good insight into who he might be as a fighter before we see him fight for the first time. And all of this was done with absolutely zero exposition or dialogue, meaning there's no character saying things or texts or voiceovers telling us all this information. We get to see it unfold with the story. This was just pure, unadulterated, good storytelling. And this is true for the introductions of the 2 other main characters as well. And both of them are done within the same 10-minute span I've been talking about, which makes it all the more impressive. And you can tell by the attention and care that clearly went into the writing of these scenes alone that these characters are very important and they are indeed the main characters. If you compare how the 3 main characters are introduced, any of them, to that one guy who comes in late to the tournament, you see the difference in effort and screen time. Even though he seems like this big bad guy, I can tell that he'll only be relevant only for this arc or even like only a few episodes, and he probably won't stick around. I'll go over how the other 2 main characters were introduced as well, but I'll be quick about it for the sake of time. Next up, we got the female lead, Mira Yu, and she only got 2 scenes for her introduction. Really, it's just 1 scene, it's just cut up in half. And again, this is the same 10 minutes that I was talking about. So scene number 1, we see that she's lost and she's kind of awkwardly asking directions to the stadium. This shows that she can be clumsy and shy, but she's also not afraid to ask for help. Then we see her shyness completely goes away when she starts complimenting these guys on their muscles and bodies. It shows that she's honest. She's the type of person that wears her emotions on her sleeves. Personally, I think even more so than Jin. And just like Jin, she doesn't hesitate to do the right thing when she offers to help chase down the thief. We also learn that she can hold her own and she doesn't take crap from anyone. This is clear in scene number 2. It's pretty much the same scene, which is cut back to it later. She gets struck in the face by a bicycle. She immediately gets up and goes after the person responsible. It's a pretty decent character intro. It only takes 2 scenes to do it. Technically just 1. That's great in my book. The last of the main characters had 3 scenes to work with. I don't know how to say his first name. It's like Dewa or something like that. So I'll just call him Han. Scene number 1, we see him at what I assume is his part-time job. He just finished working his night shift and he's gonna go directly to the tournament right after. This shows that 1, he is a hard worker who doesn't complain, and 2, he's willing to pick up more shift to make more money, which means that he desperately needs the money. And that is a hint to what his motivation might be for competing in this tournament in the first place, which is something we didn't get for the other 2 characters. Scene number 2. He's walking down the street, he sees this crazy stuff going down, and he just remains kind of calm and he doesn't really have any reaction to it. But in his mind, he's already planning out how he's gonna help them. How this guy reacts to the situation around him is vastly different from how the other 2 main characters would. He's much more stoic, he's more careful and more calculated. He does not thoughtlessly run after them. He takes a shortcut, he gets in front of the target, and he strikes them down. And unlike the other 2, he seems to keep his emotion inside. And I'll bet anything that his fighting style probably reflect those characteristics as well. And lastly, scene number 3 is when we see him stop the robber just when we think he's gonna get away. This also shows that, like the other 2, he's a good person with a good heart, but more importantly, it shows that he's dependent, that when push comes to shove, you can rely on him to do what it takes. I really like this character because he gives a good contrast in terms of personality to the other 2 characters, who are pretty similar in my opinion. This makes a really good dynamics for character development for all 3 of them, because character development basically means how the character grows by learning and adapting to things that are new to them, usually from people around them. And when we have two characters who are fundamentally different in how they act, they learn from each other and grow together, which is a really cool concept. In just about half of the episode, we learn all of that information about 3 different characters in a very creative way. Plus, usually in most animes, they would take several episodes to do this, especially the big ones like Naruto, One Piece, My Hero Academia. One Piece in particular, if I remember correctly, it spent the whole first episode introducing Luffy. In My Hero Academia, I think it spent like 5 episodes or 3 to 5 episodes before Deku actually goes to the entrance exam. So all things considered, in a very short amount of time, 9 to 10 minutes give or take, the God of High School did a very effective job of introducing its 3 main characters in one episode. Yes, it doesn't follow the comics exactly, but if this show and its writing staff keeps up this high level of storytelling, it has a legit shot of being a great anime. The God of High School does a lot of things right, but it has its flaws. The structure of the first episode is broken into halves. The first half is character introduction, and the second half is the tournament itself. The God of High School tournament is the driving force of the story, which means that the progress of the tournament dictates the pace of the plot. And it's a shame because despite great character introductions, the God of High School fails to do a good job of establishing an audience connection. Audience connection basically means how much the people watching care about the story. A good audience connection means that people are engaged and invested and feel like they're part of the story. The second half of episode 1, the God of High School tournament, is being portrayed through the perspective of the audience. I'm not talking about us, the audience watching from home. I'm talking about the characters in the show who are watching the tournament. The ones in the stadium or streaming, and we see a bunch of them too. We are experiencing the tournament from the perspective of the non-essential audience characters, pretty much twice as long as the perspective of the main characters. When it comes to the topic of the God of High School tournament, we spend 4 minutes with the audience character and just a little bit more than 1 minute with the protagonist, which is not nearly enough at all. Again, just to be clear, the amount of time I'm talking about is how much time each character spent on screen, either talking about the tournament or reacting to the tournament or showing genuine interest in it. The protagonist, Jin Mori, spends exactly 2 scenes and approximately 1 minute doing that. That's it. And these are the scenes I'm talking about. It's technically 3 scenes, but the first one doesn't really count. It's when Jin is on his way to the stadium and he's just saying to himself that he hopes there's food at the stadium. That doesn't really count. That's more of him talking about food than about a tournament. The first scene that counts is about 35 seconds long, is when Jin is talking about wanting a rematch of some kind with one of the judges. It's the very first time we see him display a clear and genuine interest in being at the tournament. The second and last one is when he pulls down one of the dude's pants. I think his name is Kang or something like that, is the guy that comes in late. And since he's part of the tournament, I'm gonna count it because Jin is reacting to the specific aspect of the environment around him. And that interaction lasts about a minute or so. We don't get nearly enough screen time dedicated to the main cast showing their interest and investment in this tournament. Instead, we got 4 minutes on 6 different occasions of the character audience perspective on the tournament. And these are different scenes with the exact same purpose being repeated over and over again. And that purpose is to give exposition on the tournament and to get us, the audience watching from home, hyped up and excited. It does this by showing us completely random bystanding characters watching, talking about a tournament with their friends, and explaining what's going on during the fights to the person next to them. There's nothing wrong with giving a little bit of exposition so as the audience from home know what the heck is going on. Most, if not all, of the story should be told through one perspective only, and that's the main characters. It's a common sense for storytelling. It helps the audience to better immerse themselves into the story by relating and finding a connection to the protagonist or the main characters. And it is very important to maintain that perspective throughout. This way, the audience in a way feel like they're the main character and part of the story. It gives a better sense of engagement with the story, like they're in the thick of it with the characters as the story moves along. This is the reason why writers work so hard to craft characters that are relatable to the target audience. Hollywood movies do it, and especially successful mainstream animes do it. This is why the main characters from popular shonen animes are preteen or teenage boys. That's who they're trying to appeal to. They want the audience to be able to put themselves in the character's shoes, be part of the experience. Again, the God of High School tournament is being told through the perspective of the audience characters. We don't get that engagement from the protagonist we should be getting. Instead, we feel like we're part of the audience. We're not down there in the ring fighting. We're observing along with these random bystanders, which we shouldn't be. From what I understand, there's no audience in the stadium for this part in the comics. I do not understand at all why they decided to do that here. It absolutely baffles me that they chose to tell this part of the story, the part that literally drives the plot, through the audience perspective. I just don't get it at all. It would have been much better if we stuck around the protagonist more, heck, or even at least the other two leads. If we could see how they react to the big crowd in the stadium as they walk in, see them trying to comprehend the rules of the tournament, introductions, or the reaction to that one guy coming in late, anything, we would have felt more involved and more engaged in what's going on. Instead, we're just sitting back outside of the circle of action, just watching. We're already doing that. We don't want to relate to the audience. We are the audience. And the audience is boring. We're boring. We want to be with the characters, live their interesting lives. We want to see what they see. We want to feel what they feel, think what they think, and experience what they're going through. This is why the sci-fi and fantasy genre is super popular. The God of High School as an anime concerns me. There's a solid example of great writing in this very episode, but it also displays a lot of bad storytelling techniques, like this bad attempt at establishing audience connection. Overall, I think it's a pretty good anime, has great action, and there's a lot of good things going for it, but if the writing staff cannot keep this high level of writing consistent, and I'm afraid that it will be reduced to a mediocre one-dimensional anime, only good for showing off fight scenes and literally nothing more. And unfortunately, I have a strong suspicion that it will. I'm not saying it's unenjoyable. These things are subjective. Whether you like or dislike something is up to you, is your opinion. If you're still hyped up for the tournament, good. I'm glad for you. I really am. I'm not trying to be sarcastic or anything. I do want this anime to succeed as much as anyone, believe me. I want to see more Korean webtoon comics get adapted into anime. There's literally an untapped territory of content just sitting there waiting. The Misfit of Demon King Academy is a new anime that came out in the summer of 2020. It's quite popular as well. It's based on a Japanese light novel series. I haven't read it myself, so I don't know how good it is. But the anime version is very one-dimensional. The only thing it seems to care about is making the protagonist look cool. It has a lot of bad writing techniques, and I want to talk about one of those. The first episode of The Misfit of Demon King Academy did a lot of things quite poorly. Things like lazily dumping expositions, world building, and character introductions. The thing I want to talk about though is how the show did a half-assed job of establishing and raising conflict in a fight. Specifically, the very first fight between the protagonist and Cepes, I think is his name. Going forward, I will refer to him as the opposing force. And you'll see in a little bit why I would want to do that. The show did not at all do a good job of establishing and raising conflict. So what's conflict, and why is it such a big deal, especially in a fight? I found the perfect definition for conflict on masterclass.com. It says, in a story, conflict is a clash between two opposing forces that creates the narrative thread for a story. I like the definition, but the way I personally describe conflict is a roadblock that must be overcome. The reason I do that is because generally when you hear the word conflict, you think of a disagreement or an argument between two or more people. Usually it's something physical, it's external, and you can see it happen. But in the context of a story, conflict can be both external and internal. An external conflict is a conflict the protagonist has against another person or thing. We call them the opposing force. It's usually the antagonist or the villain. An example of an external conflict can be something as simple as a verbal argument or a fistfight. While internal conflict is a struggle within oneself, it can be a person or a thing. It's usually in someone's mind. It can be any type of internal struggle, so it's a bit more complex. Here are two examples that will hopefully help you get an idea of what internal conflict is. In Toy Story, Buzz Lightyear is a toy who doesn't know that he's a toy. He thinks his backstory is real and he truly believes that he's alive. He struggles internally to realize and accept the fact that he's a toy. In a show called Barry, the protagonist Barry is a really good hitman who wants to become an actor. He wants to quit being a hitman and leaves all the killings and terrible things he's done behind and start a new life as a good person. Barry struggles internally to accept himself and live as a good person because he can't let go of all the bad things he's done. He condemns himself for his past actions. This is internal conflict. Barry, of course, faces external conflict as well in the form of people who keep forcing him to be a hitman. The reason conflict is so important is because it's literally the thing that makes the story. Without conflict, there's no story. 99, if not 100% of stories in existence involve some kind of conflict. If you take a look at the plot of any movie at all, it's always something versus something, or it can be someone versus their internal self. That's internal conflict. Those are usually coming of age or rite of passage films. The point is, conflict is necessary, and a good story has both types of conflicts. The fight between the protagonist and the opposing force in the Misfit of Demon King Academy severely lacks good conflict. The external conflict of this fight was hastily put together several scenes before, and there is absolutely no internal conflict to speak of. Now, I'll say this though. I'll acknowledge that the writing staff knows that conflict is necessary for this fight, so they have a scene to establish that conflict, which is the scene where this guy, the opposing force, is basically trying and failing to bully the protagonist. The show wanted this scene to let us, the audience, know that he's the bad guy and we should hate him. It attempted to establish the conflict between him and the protagonist. This way, the conflict rises even more when the fight finally happens. When the protagonist shows off how overpowered he is and finally wrecks his opposing force, there's an emotional payoff for the audience. So they do deserve some recognition and props for that, for attempting to do that at least. Again, it was very hastily put together and it feels forced and artificial. There's no stakes in the scene, meaning there's nothing to lose or gain, or at least it doesn't feel like it. The way it introduces the opposing force is very lazy. He's just kind of there for the sole purpose of being a dick. It seems to me like he wakes up one morning and goes, "Oh gee, it's time to go stand in front of that one gate and be a dick to that one guy in particular." And even worse than that, there's literally an invisible character off screen yelling out exposition about this guy. What's up with that? We're learning this information through exposition dump, not through the story. This was not earned. It's like the writing team is saying, here, you need to know this piece of information, so here's a random line about it. That's just lazy writing. And the conflict, or you could call the beef between these two characters, is one-sided. Partly because the setup is BS to begin with, but mainly because one of the parties involved doesn't care about it at all. I mean, for God's sake, even the protagonist himself is not invested in his conflict. So why should we? The show is being portrayed through the perspective of the protagonist. When the protagonist doesn't care about this part of the story, chances are the audience won't either. It's a sad excuse for a conflict. When the fight finally happens, we don't care or feel as connected as we should to this conflict. All we see is the protagonist exerting his overwhelming power and crushing his opponent, which is satisfying and it does look cool. I mean, the guy attacks him with his heartbeat. Are you kidding me? That's sick. But that's all it is. That's all it can be. There's no substance. It's just a cool looking scene that shows off an overpowered character. It's one-dimensional. Imagine if we were invested in this conflict and there's actual stake where there's something to lose or gain, because as of now, we know that the protagonist is never gonna lose. This fight could have had a much more significant emotional payoff. So even though the show looks cool, there's a reason it's not on the same level as other shows with overpowered main characters that aren't one-dimensional like this one. It doesn't quite have the same level of ratings and probably won't ever be as good. There's more bad things to say about the Misfit of Demon King Academy, but I won't because there's some good things to say about it too. Now, I want to be clear, just because I don't like the writing and it's not my favorite show this season, doesn't automatically mean it's bad. This type of show keeps getting made and keeps being watched for a reason. If it is your cup of tea, that's great, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm a huge fan of anime in general. I want all anime to succeed. Compared to the Western media, especially Hollywood films, I think anime is much more versatile and just fun. So the more success and relevance anime gets in general, the happier I am. Before I end, I want to briefly talk about Ocean's 11. Recently, I had to watch Ocean's 11 for an assignment, and I want to talk about this notable scene that I thought was cool. It is a character introduction scene, but what I want to talk about is the scene setting. It's a short and simple scene, very compact. It gives you a good example of what to consider when setting up a scene. What is a scene setting or a scene setup? Scene setting or scene setup is the action of creating an environment in a way that serves the purpose of the scene or the story. Basically creating the situation within the scene, the location of the scene, and literally everything else in the scene should be relevant to the story. The first step of scene setting. Ask yourself what the scene is about. What are you trying to accomplish in the scene? Ideally, every scene should move the story forward. The audience should walk away from the scene with a new information or new feeling. So you really have to consider what the purpose of the scene is. Once you have that figured out, you need to consider what is the best environment to accomplish that goal. The environment of the scene is the situation within the scene, the time, the place, the general area, and the people within it. And having the perfect environment is crucial to how people view your story. For example, if I were to ask you to picture a character who goes to a night school on a Saturday at a community college, and picture another character who goes to a 9 a.m. class at Stanford University. Now, both of them are students, but you probably pictured them differently. If I asked you where they work, your answer is probably different as well. And that's because of the environment that they're in. After you figure out the perfect environment for the scene, the next step, and this is very important, you need to know what you should highlight. If something is not important to the story or it literally won't show up again, do not pay any attention or screen time to it. It's essential that you do not include unnecessary details. It wastes time, it's giving useless information to the audience, it is distracting. You want to keep the audience as focused and engaged in the story as possible. Now coming back to the scene setting in Ocean's 11, it is Danny Ocean's introduction scene. He is the protagonist of the film. It's a great introduction, but let's ask the same questions for the scene setting. What is this particular scene trying to accomplish? It's an introduction scene, so obviously it needs to introduce the character. It needs to introduce his personality. It needs to show how he interacts with other people. Include that interaction because if done right, it can convey a lot about the character in a very subtle way. But this is not always necessary because there's a bunch of movies and animes that have character introduction scenes with absolutely no dialogue exchanged. A great example that came to mind right away is Cell's introduction scene in Dragon Ball Z. This scene also needed to give the exposition about Danny's past to the audience, and it also needs to set up his motivation. If you've seen this movie before or if you've been paying attention, you'll notice that this scene shows the entirety of Danny Ocean's character. It tells us his past, what he's like in the present, and what he's going to do in the future. It's absolutely fantastic. Now, typically, when you introduce a character, you want action rather than words. If you can do both, that's great. But as the saying goes, actions speak louder than words. It's just a guy sitting there talking, but the film still makes the scene work despite pretty much only relying on dialogue. And it did that by having the perfect environment for the scene, good scene setting. It needed to get the exposition on Danny across, so it created the situation that makes sense. It makes perfect sense to hear the parole board talk about his past criminal records and ask him if he feels like he's rehabilitated, ask what he's going to do next after release, things like that. And it makes sense because of the situation he's in, a parole hearing. It works because the situation is reasonable and is very easily believable. The environment is only focused on what matters and nothing else. There's Danny Ocean, he's a prisoner, he's at a parole hearing, it's a room in a prison, and that's all we needed to know. That's his whole environment. That's all that matters right now in the situation. And all of that is working toward what the scene is trying to accomplish, which is to introduce Danny. This is a little bit off topic, but I also want to talk about the cinematography and editing. It really helped the scene. The whole scene is pretty much a static shot, meaning there's no camera movement. We stay on Danny only because he's the focus of the scene. He's the only one that matters. We literally don't see anything else. We don't even see the parole hearing board. This is tuning out the unnecessary information. It keeps us drawn in. We start off wide in a medium shot. We see just a little bit below his waist. As the scene progresses, we move in tighter on Danny in a close-up shot. This technique helps deepen our connection with the character and the tension of the scene. It's the same principle as real-life conversation. It's like when you're talking to someone and you're focused on them, you're drawn to them and you kind of tune out everything around you. This is also called the reaction shot. It's where you start out with a wide shot or a medium shot. We call that conversational shot because, like I said, you're talking to someone. And at the climax of the scene, we cut to the tightest shot on the character to get that important reaction. It's a really useful technique in visual storytelling to highlight the emotion of the scene or the character. We move closer as we reach the climax of this conversation. And this is the coolest thing about this scene. We're very close to George Clooney. We're waiting for his answer to,
Mr. Ocean, what do you think you would do if released?
We anticipate closely. But it never comes. At this point, because of the clever expositional dialogue earlier in this scene, we know that Danny Ocean is a con artist. His answer was probably something along the line of, I'll find an honest job and be a decent tax-paying citizen. We didn't need to hear it. Instead, in the very next scene, we don't see him planning, but already putting together his next heist. Ocean's 11 did an amazing job at setting up the scene to introduce its protagonist. It's a very good example to look at when you're trying to consider how to set up a scene. My name is Nick, and this is my podcast where I talk about notable storytelling techniques in movies, TV shows, but mostly animes, and I want to ask for your help. I love stories and storytelling. It's my favorite thing in the world. I love making this podcast, and I want this channel to grow. I want to do this as a job. It's a dream that I have. I'm a broke college student and I'm trying to find my own path in this world. If you like my content, if you want to support me, if you believe in my dream, please tell your friends about my podcast. You can post a screenshot or a link or anything on Twitter or Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, any social media platform you might use. It will really help me grow. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I hope you have a great day.